It happened in 2019 in the state of Missouri. Not many people know about it, probably because at the time everyone was concerned about COVID. At that time, I had already graduated from the Institute 3 years ago and was working as a social worker. The first time was very difficult. A huge number of cases, emotionally exhausting cases, a constant sense of responsibility for people's fates. But my colleague Karen gave me great support, for which I was eternally grateful. In my first year of work, I thought about quitting almost every week. What was most frightening was the realization that we couldn't help everyone. Sometimes I would come home feeling completely drained, but what kept me going was a strong desire to make the world at least a little better. I especially wanted to help children in difficult life situations, but this story is not about me, it's about my colleague Karen. Karen was 50 years old. She had worked in social services for about 20 years and was the most experienced among us. She was known and respected not only in our office, but also outside of it. Over the years, she had been honored many times as the best social worker of the year. Her colleagues treated her with respect, and her superiors openly expressed admiration. Karen was known for her dedication. She often stayed late at work, took extra shifts, and was always ready to pick up a difficult case if someone was not coping. We all thought of her as a person with a huge heart. Karen had no family or children. Many of us thought she was just filling her life with work so she wouldn't feel lonely. Karen knew how to support a coworker when needed and always found the right words to reassure or motivate. She often helped me with paperwork when I was getting bogged down with reports and documents. Karen was a true role model for me. It seemed like nothing was impossible in her world, but as I learned later, behind her outward resilience was a story that changed the way I thought about her and our work. Everything changed in the winter of 2019. I still remember that day very clearly. It was around 11 in the morning. My colleagues and I were sitting at our computers, drinking coffee, and discussing the complex case of one troubled family. It was an ordinary morning, nothing to portend trouble. Suddenly, the door of our office cracked open and masked men burst in. They were armed, and their appearance instantly froze the air with panic. First, they shouted at us not to move, then they ordered us away from the computers, and then they forced us to lie face down on the floor. Our hearts were pounding frantically, none of us realizing what was happening. They started asking questions, demanding to know which one of us was Corinne, but Corinne wasn't in the office that day. No one knew why. She didn't give any notice that she would be late or take the day off, nor did she text any of us. This was completely unlike her. Corinne had always been punctual and responsible. After a few minutes, it became clear that these men were FBI agents. They began to seize documents, computers, and other materials related to our work, and then we were taken for interrogation. The interrogations lasted endlessly. We were questioned about every case we handled, where we placed people's personnel files, which families we supervised. They asked questions about Corinne, what our relationship was with her, what we knew about her personal life, if we had noticed anything strange. They were especially interested in employees with more than 10 years of experience. I couldn't understand what the FBI wanted from us. We're just social workers. Our job is to help people, not break the law. But the thing that shocked me the most was that their main focus was Corinne, this woman, who I had always thought was the epitome of kindness and professionalism, had attracted the attention of the FBI. What could this saintly woman have done to interest federal agencies? When I finally learned the truth, my world fell apart. Everything I knew, everything I believed in, turned out to be a lie. I haven't been able to trust people since. Probably never will be able to. It turns out that Corinne had been secretly trading in our subjects' data for years. Children and teenagers were particularly valuable. As social workers, we have access to a vast database that holds almost everything from medical records to details of families' lives, including their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. It turned out that this information was of huge value to people willing to pay a lot of money for it. Why? Because our mentees are some of the most vulnerable people in society. They are children and teenagers from troubled families who are in critical situations. Many of them never get real protection from the system. When they go missing, the police often don't even start looking for them, blaming it on difficult family circumstances or running away. As far as I understood in the process of investigating the case, it turned out that a large number of our clients, whose data Karen sold, were kidnapped. Some were sold into labor slavery, some into sexual slavery, mostly children and teenagers. Some were even sold for organs. Most often, the disappearance of children was explained by problems in the family and written off as parental negligence. In the case of teenagers, the police usually assumed that they had simply run away. This became a particularly convenient excuse if the teenager had already attempted to run away or had once returned home after leaving. Such cases rarely attracted attention, and there was little or no search. This was part of the system. Teenagers with troubled pasts were thought to be responsible for their own fate. During the investigation, it emerged that during Karen's years as a social worker, the lives of 80 people had been affected by her actions. These children were abducted and used for the most horrific purposes, but those are just the officially confirmed cases. How many more victims are there that we will never know about? But the worst part of this story is that no one would have ever known about all this if one of the victims had not found the strength to escape. But it wasn't enough for Corinne to just sell our subject's data. She decided to build an entire business around it, find new ways to capitalize on it. And as you can imagine, in our profession, finding the right person for the job is easy. I don't know the name of the man she was involved with, but I do know that he had some serious psychological issues. He was a real scumbag with no moral fiber. Karen started targeting teenage girls who had a history of running away. They became her target group, her victims. How did she lure them in? I don't know all the details, but somehow she would find a way to gain their trust by offering help or shelters to make the teens feel safe. And then she would kidnap them. Corinne and her accomplice organized a special place. It was an old house somewhere on the outskirts of town. This crazy man would rape these girls to get them pregnant, and then they'd sell the babies for I don't even want to think about. The problem was that all the girls Karen picked were from dysfunctional families. These kids were already listed as troubled in the system, labeled with a propensity to run away. Such teenagers often went unnoticed, their disappearance attracting little attention. The police did not look for them seriously, and parents usually either could not or did not know how to find their children. These factors made them perfect victims for Corinne. The system would simply let them go, allowing Karen and her accomplice to continue their horrific activities unhindered. In 5 years, they kidnapped 13 girls, maybe more. 4 of them are known to have died during childbirth. 2 were killed for attempting to escape. Also, according to the girls, those who couldn't get pregnant or carry a child were also killed. All the bodies were buried in the same forest where the house was located. The victims were between 14 and 16 years old at the time of the abduction. The victims lived in the basement of this secluded house, which they had specially equipped as a prison. Each girl was kept in her own separate cage, like an animal cut off from the world. Karen rarely visited them. She usually brought food with her to maintain the illusion of caring, but her visits were rare and brief. The rest of the time, this man, whose name I never learned, was with them, controlling and threatening. He was their only warden, and no one around them knew or suspected what went on behind the walls of that dreadful place. The dark basement, the locked doors, the hopelessness, it was all part of their creepy reality, and no one knew how many other children were suffering in such secret places. For 5 years, no one even suspected what was going on in that house. But everything changed when one day this man entered the cage of one of the girls at the moment when he was about to commit an evil act. It was at that moment that he grabbed his chest and fell. His blood clot had broken off. The girls were lucky they were able to get out. What happened next, I don't think I need to tell you. You already understand how it ended. The police found enough evidence to sentence Corinne to death, but unfortunately she could not be found. She probably arrived at the house, saw that no one was there, and decided to go into hiding. Maybe she was ready for it. As far as I know, the investigation is still open and Karen is still wanted. This case has not been widely publicized, no correspondence or news coverage. We have been forbidden to discuss it, and perhaps the reason is that the investigation is still ongoing. Perhaps the authorities are trying to find all the participants in this tragedy, or perhaps they are afraid of a public outcry. After all of this happened, I quit my job. I moved to California, took makeup courses, and now I work in a beauty salon. I don't want anything to remind me of this story and my former life. To this day, I still live in terror and fear. I often think about how many people in the world are still living in slavery and we don't even know about them. The fact that we learned about the victims of this story by miracle, through chance, is shocking. My name is Nancy. I am a social worker, and I live in the state of Washington, in the city of Shelton. I want to share with you a story that still haunts me. For those who don't know, social services is constantly interacting with other government agencies, including schools. One day, we received a request from a school to check on a family. This was a routine thing for us. The school teacher told us about a child's strange behavior. For some reason, he did not want to come home after class. This boy was not from a dysfunctional family. He lived in a good neighborhood, studied well, and according to the school nurse, there were no injuries or beatings on him. But there seemed to be no serious cause for concern. But the class teacher was very worried about the boy and persisted in talking about his strange behavior. As far as I know, the teacher tried to contact the child's mother, but she did not come to school for some reason. We assumed that the mother was working very hard. She was raising her son alone and probably did not have time to visit the school, so we decided to visit them at home. The school provided us with their address, and I went there to ask some questions, talk to them, and make sure everything was okay. I got in my car and went to the address given. It was a house in an ordinary neighborhood. When I got to the door, I knocked, but no one opened the door for me. I knocked again and waited for a while. Once I was sure that there was probably no one home, I was about to go back to my car. But just as I grabbed the handle of the door, I heard the door of the house open. A woman's voice came from somewhere in the back of the room. "Come on in." I closed the car door and headed back toward the house. No one met me on the doorstep. Inside, everything looked pretty ordinary, cozy, and clean. As I walked forward, I noticed a woman sitting on the couch. It was the boy's mother. She looked very pale and thin. I asked her how she was feeling, if she was all right. She replied that she was fine. However, her appearance made me wonder. Perhaps she was ill. She did not give the impression of a person who was using drugs or abusing alcohol. I am a good judge of that. I have seen quite a few people like that. But she looked extremely tired and, for some reason, too pale. We talked for a while. I sat down on the couch and we discussed her son. I told her that the school teacher was worried about the boy, having noticed that he had become depressed, taciturn, and unwilling to come home. I then asked the standard questions about their family situation, where she works, what the father does, whether everything was okay at home. The woman answered very sluggishly, almost silently. I asked her if she needed help, if she might be depressed, or if she needed a psychologist or other specialist. All the time I felt that something was wrong here, but I couldn't figure out what it was. At the end of the meeting, I filled out the necessary paperwork, said goodbye to the woman, and walked back to my car. I had 2 more families to visit that day. Toward the end of the day, I received a call from a colleague in the office. She told me that I had no need to go to the boy's mother's house tomorrow, but I interrupted her and replied that I had already visited the woman today, as I was in the neighborhood and decided not to postpone the visit. I added that everything seemed to be in order and that I would bring the papers to work tomorrow. After these words, my colleague fell silent. She was silent for a long time, as if she didn't know what to say, and then she asked, "Nancy, who were you talking to?" I was a little confused and answered, "To the boy's mom." Then she said quietly but firmly, "You couldn't have been talking to the boy's mom. Her body was found in the woods this morning. She's been dead for about a week." At first, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The only logical thought that came to my mind was that the woman I was talking to was not the boy's mother, but if she was, who was she? What happened next was a police check. The boy was handed over to his father. When asked who he had been living with all week, he answered firmly, his mom. At first, we thought the boy's mother might have had a twin sister, but there was no evidence of a twin sister. It happened in 2005. I was 12 years old at the time, and my mom worked as a social worker. She came home from work late one night. I noticed right away that my mom was very scared. She was yelling at me to pack my things and run to the car. I tried to find out where we were going and what had happened, but she was thrashing around the apartment as if trying to quickly think of something or decide. After 5 minutes, she looked out the window, froze in place, and said bitterly, "Too late." It was already dark outside. She told me to close all the doors and draw the curtains on the windows as quickly as possible. I looked at her and saw how scared she was, and her fear made me scared too. Even worse was the fact that I had no idea what was going on. At one point, I even thought my mom had lost her mind. I cried and begged her to call the police, but she did not react to my words. Then she took the icon and the cross that my grandmother had given us a long time ago. This surprised me the most because my mom was a non-religious person. After that, she locked all the doors with locks and then told me to go with her to the closet. We hid and sat there in complete silence. About an hour passed. During that time, my mom stopped crying and I calmed down a bit too. Still not understanding what was going on, I quietly asked, "Mom, what happened? Why did we lock ourselves in the house and hide in the closet?" She only shushed me and whispered, "Sit quietly." I could barely control myself. I wanted to just jump out of the closet, go downstairs, get the phone and call my father. But he was on a business trip in another city, and deep down I knew that wouldn't help. Literally 15 minutes later, I heard someone walking around our house. Yet I didn't hear the front door open, windows breaking, or any sounds at all indicative of intrusion. I got really scared. First, because my mom, always so strong, was sitting in the closet with me and wouldn't stop crying. Second, someone was walking through our house and I had absolutely no idea who or what it was. Third, this someone just appeared in the house as if he came out of nowhere. He didn't touch anything, he didn't open anything, he didn't make any sound other than footsteps. Those footsteps echoed for hours. During that time, it seemed to me that my mother had turned completely gray. Toward morning, the footsteps stopped. Only when it dawned outside the window did we dare to come out of the closet. Mom and I walked around the house. All the windows and doors were locked from the inside, with no sign of forced entry. While Mom checked the house, she called Dad. After their conversation, she said that we needed to pack right away and take only the essentials. I tried to find out what happened and what Dad said, but Mom was adamant. "Father is waiting for us in another city." We got in the car and left. We drove for days, staying overnight in cheap motels. Eventually, we got to Seattle, which was the city where Dad had a business trip. Mom and Dad talked alone for a long time so that I couldn't hear anything. They took turns sleeping at night, as if they were afraid we would be found. We ended up living in Seattle. My parents never told me anything about what happened then. It's been 20 years. I had almost forgotten about the story, but I recently learned something that made me remember everything. In 2005, that very night, my mom's coworkers died under strange circumstances. Two of them had a stroke and one of them committed suicide. I tried to talk to my mom again, but she won't tell me anything. I still don't know what really happened that night.